Hi, I'm Dr. Kujan. Together with our other Faith Formation members for the adults, we are on a Lenten retreat of sorts, looking at how we have experienced obstacles to our life in Christ. In our first session of this new series, which we began last Sunday, we took a look at 3 temptations that we often experience. In fact, these temptations are as old as time itself. If we look to Genesis chapter 3, we see that Eve and Adam's first temptation was to break the only commandment of God, which was not to eat of the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It notes in Genesis 3 verse 6 that Eve saw the fruit of this tree and saw that it looked good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and it was desirable to make her wise and to be like God. Fast forward all the way close to the end of the Bible, we see in 1 John 2:16 that there are 3 main forms of temptation we experience. Those include the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And John notes that this is basically the same thing we've been dealing with since the beginning. And he, in his letter, talks about the new commandment, which is basically the same commandment from God that has always been given to us. A commandment to obey, not because God just loves giving us rules to follow and loves denying us good things, but because these temptations lead us away from what we're really made for. And they ultimately, when we fall into these temptations, cause us to be less happy on a deep spiritual level than we otherwise would. And, if we look to Jesus, who went through the desert for 40 days and 40 nights and endured 3 temptations from the devil, we see the same pattern here. What's going on is, on the one hand, we experience desires for bodily goods, things that bring us pleasure or satisfaction in a physical sense. Additionally, there's this desire for external goods, things out there that look enticing, that I'd love to just take for myself out of greed or something like that. And that's basically the lust of the eyes, that we see things out in the world that are enticing and desirable. And although we can enjoy the good things of the body and good things out there in the world, we shouldn't do so at the expense of our relationships with God and other people. So the third and worst of the temptations, in fact, is called the pride of life by John in 1 John chapter 2. And it also continues the issue that Eve experienced when she was tempted. She wanted to take the fruit so she could be like God and be wise, like God is wise. To be prideful in oneself rather than to rely on God is a fundamental obstacle to our life in Christ. So when Jesus was tempted in the desert, he rejected the temptation to turn stone into bread and satisfy his physical bodily desires. He also refused to bow down before Satan in order to reign over all the kingdoms of the world, although it looked very enticing. Jesus denied that. And then finally, when Satan asks him to throw himself off the top of the temple to test God, that's a very prideful thing that would involve, and Jesus rightly rejects that as a temptation. But we, like Jesus, all experience these 3 fundamental temptations: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And Jesus, fortunately, gives us a remedy for these temptations. In Matthew chapter 6, in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount, he gives 3 ways to overcome them. One is fasting, another almsgiving, and another prayer, which should be familiar because these are the 3 things that we want to do during Lent. This comes from the very reading that kicks off Lent in Ash Wednesday, that we deny ourselves certain physical bodily pleasures and goods in order to make room in our hearts for God and love of our neighbor. We give alms to the poor in order to not be greedy and to hold on to the things we have and the things we want with all our might. we can let go and trust God instead, like the lilies of the field, trust God to dress them with adorning beauty as flowers. And then finally, when it comes to prayer, that's a way to really get at our tendency to pride. Because when we're prideful, we want to use our time however we want, and we want to put ourselves in the middle of everything. But prayer is the opposite. Prayer directs our time and attention toward God, who really matters. So this Lenten season, let's try to keep in mind the temptations we experience on a daily basis and ask for God's help as we, during Lent, pray, fast, and give alms for the sake of God's kingdom. In our next session coming up this coming Sunday, we'll be looking at the 7 deadly sins that flow from these 3 temptations. At the root of all sin, you will find these 7 deadly sins, and we will talk about them in our next session. So if you can join us, love to see you there.